But basically, these are names of the people who died in the fire on this list here. Carmel. That's the list of the people who died. On November 28, 19, February 28. Yeah,
How big was the fire? I mean, because there's a lot of names.
well, it was like they were having a meeting. See where that building is? There was a building there, maybe 4 times that size. And they were in the building, surrounded by the ATF. And they said they are not coming out. So it was like a siege. They were in, and the policemen were outside, and they said they're not coming in. But according to the way things went, the fire started there, and they still didn't come out. And it is said that the building was surrounded by the ATF. And even if they wanted to come out, they couldn't come out because people feel as if it was their intention that they all should die.
The burnout took place because there was some things said against the Branch Davidians in regard to their practicing with their guns, which was really not illegal in Texas for them to do that. But the ATF had been called by someone from the church, Seventh-day Adventist Church. They didn't want them to be using those guns for what they had been told was to perform the slaughter of Ezekiel 9. How they learned about it, I don't know, but there were some saying that the Davidians were going to perform the slaughter of Ezekiel 9. So they didn't want that to take place. They came there, they wanted the people to come out. The people refused to come out. And so as a result, a fire started. How it got started, I can't say. But the fire started, and that was when they were burned out.
I would say in the David Koresh himself, he spent a lot of time studying the seven seals, and to him it was like Judgment Day, and he didn't decide to come out from the compound, you know. But from the very beginning, the people were being, I would say, investigated by the ATF. And David Koresh used to live there. It is not there right now. So I thought basically for Human Shield, he called a meeting. At the time, he think that this showdown would take place. So they were basically having like a convention there because these people who died there don't live there. They don't live here. They were at this convention. And it's during that convention that the attack from the ATF took place. And they decided that they would not come out. Now, in my estimation, if the ATF or the police force wanted to accost Mr. Koresh, it could be done without have to do all of that. Because I came there in the past, saw him, talked to him. He goes through the gate, he goes to Waco, he goes to town, all that. They didn't have to bring an army to come and catch one man.
The Davidian Seventh-day Adventists were a religious group that arose out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church led by then Sabbath school teacher Victor T. Houteff. Houteff was a Bulgarian immigrant in the mercantile trade who arrived in the United States virtually penniless after a mob from the Bulgarian Orthodox Church forced him onto a boat headed for the United States. Once in the United States, Houteff found work in the hotel industry as a grocer. In 1919, prompted by his attendance to several revival meetings conducted by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Houteff became a Seventh-day Adventist. To be closer to the Adventist community, Houteff eventually moved to California, where he became a Maytag salesman and started his own business manufacturing what he called health sweets.
But he was a zealous sort of fella. He was very successful as a businessman and a salesman in California. But when he got to the church, he looked at it and saw it in terms of being already lax and people who weren't really committed to their faith.
Houteff's commitment to fundamental Adventism grew, and the more he witnessed what he felt was laxness in these principles, the more alarmed he grew. Houteff would later pen a list of customs practiced in the church he felt departed from fundamental Adventist practices titled Partial List of Corruptions in his book, The Shepherd's Rod, Volume 1. Houteff stayed active in the church and began to teach a Sabbath school class which grew in popularity quickly. During his studies, Houteff began to delve into prophecies in the biblical book of Isaiah and began to apply them directly to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. His interpretations of Scripture, which called for a thorough reform, were viewed as radical by church leaders. Houteff's views diverged from the General Conference, the governing body for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and eventually he and some in his Sabbath school group were disfellowshipped.
He began to publish his work. The main reason why he took this initiative is because he gave the church leadership his thesis on this doctrine of the shepherd's rod, and he didn't think they did justice in investigating it, proving to him that it was wrong. So he decided to go ahead and promote it so that everyone would have the opportunity to listen to it, to understand it.
A key idea for him is centered around the book of Revelation, talks about 144,000 people. This presumably is to be those who are closest to God, or those who will be restored at the end of history, or whatever. So, by the time he was writing his critiques of the Seventh-day Adventists, there were about 300,000 Seventh-day Adventists. So clearly only half of them could have possibly been among these elect, or these 144,000. So he was very critical of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and wrote The Shepherd's Rod, which was a summary of his teachings, and said that they would be judged.
As Houteff gained more and more adherents to his message, which numbered in the hundreds, he saw the need to find a place to establish a biblical-style prophetic school and printing operation to spread his message to the church. In 1935, Houteff and his closest followers, taking a cue from several Old Testament scriptures, Micah 7:14 and Ezekiel 47, to dwell solitarily in the woods and move his message eastward from California, went to Texas searching for land. They purchased 189 acres in a rural area near Waco, Texas, outside the city limits to establish their publishing house. The land near Waco was mostly undeveloped, and workers began to trickle in to complete the work of setting up a headquarters to run the printing operation. They called the publishing house the Universal Publishing Association, and the surrounding camp they set up Mount Carmel Center. They would eventually mail out thousands of tracts to members of the Adventist Church. To Houteff, the name Mount Carmel signified a place of victory for ancient Israel. He later wrote in one of his publications that it represented a spiritual pasture of doctrinal food. The rift between Houteff's movement and the Seventh-day Adventist Church deepens. Houteff gives the name Davidian to all who follows his message. writing that the Adventist leadership who reject his message are like the ancient Israelite King Saul, while those who accept it are as King David, his successor. World War II is in full swing, and Davidian ministerial students, unwilling to bear arms against fellow Christians, seek to be classed as conscientious objectors. Unable to attain this status from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Houteff forms the General Association of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists and writes a tract called Military Stand, detailing the organization's reasons for seeking the non-combatant status. He structures his organization by writing a manual called the Leviticus and sets up an executive council, a board which functions as a governing body for the association. Houteff himself was viewed by the people as one who especially received inspiration from God, a prophet, and was the voice of authority at the headquarters.
This old building was where we ate and cooked our food and had our bakery, and it leaked quite a bit, so they put a lot of tar on the roof. And so when it caught a fire at 5:30 in the morning, we was all coming from the camps, different places. Oh, I would say 50 to 70 people. We were so scared and sad that our brand new refrigerator that we waited for 2 years or 3 was in there, and our Hobart machine that made our bread. And so we was praying, and this little place right here was the only faucet we had. And Brother Houteff says, we're going to stop right here. We'll kneel down on these rocks and ask God to save our refrigerator and our Hobart machine, because the rest of the building's not much. Anyway, we all knelt down. He prayed. When we opened our eyes, there was only smoke, not fire. We were flabbergasted. I never will forget that.
The followers that I've talked with who knew him said we really admired him. He didn't put up with any foolishness. He was very strict and demanding, but at the same time, he didn't, like a lot of people in this position, take on a lot of privileges, financial or comfort or pleasure or what have you. In other words, they saw him as one of the group, one of the gang. He's dressed roughly. He ate with the people and so on and so forth. And then when and so he was really respected for that. But he was authoritarian. He actually wrote a little constitution for the group. And he was the president, and then there were other officers as well. And the other officers, if they were replaced, had to be approved by him. So it was very top down. He was in control of things. But he did win a lot of respect simply because he was taking the lumps with everybody else in the Depression, I think, and being one of the gang, one of the group, in that sense.
According to the scripture, we find that 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20 states that no scripture is of any private interpretation. And the part that is needed for us down here in the latter days was the book of Daniel, which was shut up to the time of the end, and the book of Revelation. And so he came as an interpreter to tell us what the beast in Daniel's prophecy and the great image and the things in the book of Revelation.
He established himself really as the leader of this group, as a kind of they recognized him as a prophet or somebody who speaks for God. And that was really the source of his authority. So from 1935 to 55, he was looked upon himself as a kind of a new Elijah and a new John the Baptist, sort of paving the way, declaring the way for the coming of the Messiah. So it's that kind of language that is used and why he had so much authority. And in all of his teaching, he would say, Well, it's like unrolling a scroll that you haven't read. And so we open up these new passages and read those. So he says what he's doing is explaining. He's building on the prophets that have gone before. So Seventh-day Adventists actually came out of William Miller and Seventh-day Adventist Church. Miller said Christ is coming back in 1844. He had the calculations based on numerology in the Bible. And of course that didn't occur. So Ellen White picked up the story and said, well, there was a really important thing that occurred at that time. Jesus in heaven did what the Adventists called investigative judgment. So he opened the book of life. These will be saved, these will not be saved. And so, I mean, who's to say yes or no to that? It's unprovable. You can't say one way or the other. But the people who followed her then believed that, and in a way she saved the Seventh-day Adventist Church for its future. So she's really important as a prophetess in that denomination. So what the Davidians do is say, well, there are these different stages, these different angels that give us different bits of information as we go along. And so just as we had William Miller, and we had Ellen White, and then they will go back to all the way to Martin Luther, and they'll count 6 prophets. And so, well, here we are at the 7th, and this is the end of things.
By now, Mount Carmel Center has grown. The Davidians have built a community that is centered on running the printing press and evangelism efforts. A school was erected for the children of the workers, a dormitory for laborers and visitors, a cafeteria, a nursing home for their elderly believers, and office buildings. The Davidians also maintained a peach orchard, a dairy, and even built a dam for Lake Waco. The Davidian work ethic, inspired by Houteff himself, hinged on principles of hard work, meticulous organization, and, as Houteff put it, producing more than consuming. The community was partially self-sufficient, growing their own produce and selling it, supporting local businesses, and even dispensing their own currency for trading purposes within the community.
As far as what Mount Carmel was like, it was a regimen that we had a certain time we get up, certain time we had our meals. After that, I and the other students went to class till our lunch time. And then after lunch, we went to work like all the rest. And evening time, we did our studying. And we did that day after day, continuing on with the work that needed to be done. And during those 3 years, we had to go to class, and we had our chance to speak on Friday night to tell what we've learned and how we were learning the message. And we also went to Baylor University and took some classes there. We took speech and also radio, so we could learn how to talk and so on. And we took English. And it was during those times that I was there for those 3 years.
Then go out into the community and work as carpenters, nurses, whatever skills they had in the Waco community. Some stayed there on the property that they had. They planted an orchard. They sold the fruit off of the orchard. They planted other crops and so forth. They had also to run their own community, so they had a school, which was an alternative school there on the campus. And at the school, it's interesting, their curriculum was 1/3 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, as we say. But then another third was biblical instruction, which you would expect. And yet a third was practical kinds of activities. So teach the kids how to sew, carpenter, and so on and so forth, so that they could have a source of income. So it was a part of the training for their economy.
We all had to work. The children had little paths to make with there's lots of rocks. And we would make rock walls for the people to go into these, and they would fix the paths and then we'd put the rocks, on either side, and that was our job when we were little. And we would help out wherever we could. Brother Houteff's, his way from the old country, children didn't just waste their time doing nothing. They accomplished something. And that's what his aim was, to help us children to want to work when we got older, because you're not handed a meal ticket forever. You have to work for it when you get older and to pay your bills. And that's the only way you're going to be productive and not be a parasite and expect somebody else to pay for what you are capable of doing. So that was his way of teaching us young people to love to work.
They did manage to make this thing work throughout the Depression, which I think was a pretty remarkable achievement.
The Davidian Seventh-day Adventists were known for their plain manner of dress and simple living. For 30 years, the community flourished and grew, but in 1955, Houteff dies suddenly of heart failure. After Houteff's death, his wife Florence Houteff issues a letter to the governing body of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, the Executive Council. In the letter, Florence urges 3 demands. Florence wants to be appointed vice president and effectively ousts current vice president E.T. Wilson. She also demands that her brother is appointed as executive secretary in her stead, and that the council forever be responsible for supporting her as Houteff's widow. By the end of the day, Florence's demands are approved by the council, and a new era begins for the Davidian. Under Florence Houteff's leadership, the Davidians begin to change their communication campaign tactics to the Adventist Church. A more aggressive style is adopted, and protests are staged by attaching signs on cars at Adventist conferences, as well as advertising on city buses. Then Florence makes a fateful decision. She pens a letter to the Seventh-day Adventist General Conference predicting the start of a prophetic time period, a 42-month period found in Revelation 11. Florence predicted that the end of this time period would occur in April 1959, after which the judgment of Ezekiel 9 would immediately take place.
It was in 1954. My class was over. My work was done on the new printing shop that we were building. And so I left in 54, and then I learned, to my surprise and to other Davidians, that in 1955, Brother Houteff died. But there's something that needs to be understood, that in 1954, while he was alive, he made the comment that was broadcast to everybody at Mount Carmel that there is a latter-day application to the 42 months in Revelation chapter 11. When you read the chapter, you can see that there is some things that takes place before and after that does show a latter-day application. And so it was after he died that the vice president was Brother Wilson. He was supposed to take over and lead the association in its work. But Sister Houteff claimed that Brother Houteff said she would to be vice president in the event of his death, and no one really could contest her on it. So she continued in that position.
So Florence was, this was a shock to everybody in the community in 55 when he died. He was supposed to live to announce this new era, this new age. And so his wife took over, and she took some pretty dramatic steps in order to win the following. One was to announce that this event, whatever it was that was going to happen, would occur in 3.5 years. So the number 7 recurs in the Bible over and over again, and multiples of it or portions of it and so forth. So spring or Easter of 1959 is when this was supposed to happen. So they had, according to the local newspapers, they estimate from 600 to 900 people who came and lived in tents and so forth for a month, anticipating some big event, which of course never transpired. But anyway, she predicted that would happen, and when that failed in '59, then she was discredited. So in the end of '62, by '62, they disbanded the Davidian group altogether from a legal point of view. And then, of course, the Branch Davidians pick up where they left off.
She began to teach a 42-month period starting in November and ending in April of 1959, but nothing happened that she had predicted. She thought the slaughter was coming in that particular year and was preaching it. The slaughter of Ezekiel 9 spoken of in Sister White's writings. And so as a result, she began to dissolve Mount Carmel.
The other thing she did was to say, well, you know, we have this property in the edge of Waco, because Waco was expanding, and that was good commercial property for residences. And so they began to sell much of their 900 plus acres, and it's very lucrative. And so they said, well, let's take this and buy another property. And so that's when they went out toward Elk, which is outside the city, a good bit further away. So there are really two Mount Carmel properties. So this was another important change that occurred under her supervision. She was regarded by folks quite differently. She was much, much younger than Victor Houteff. And so these folks, he had instituted a thing called the second tithe, and so you tithe or give a tenth of your money and then a second tenth as well, and that was to be used for retirement and that sort of thing. So that gets all bound up in legal issues when they folded and so forth, who gets that money and so forth. Anyway, the people who talk about her at this point in time, a lot of them are very critical, because she took $20,000, which was quite a lot at that time, went to California and remarried and so forth. So it's, you know, whereas her husband tended to sacrifice for the group, most people thought that she was using it for her own advantage.
Donna Dare says that there were some Davidians who never agreed with Florence's teachings and adhered only to Houteff's original writings. He, with a small group of the Davidians, began to regroup and reorganize in California in 1961. Eventually, they moved their operation to Salem, South Carolina in 1970 and start reprinting the Shepherd's Rod literature. They named their association the General Association of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists and set up the organization just as Houteff did. Out of this small group, the largest group of Davidians today will emerge, the lesser-known Davidian Seventh-day Adventist. These Davidians claim that Houteff's movement continued with them because, unlike the Branch Davidians, they haven't deviated from or added to Houteff's teaching. In 1961, Florence and the entire Executive Council tendered their resignation in a letter. At the same time, Florence was teaching her 42-month doctrine. A Davidian named Benjamin Roden appears on the scene. Roden claims to be the prophet Elijah to take Houteff's place. Like Florence Houteff, Ben Roden begins to modify teachings of Victor Houteff. Roden gains a following by acquiring the mailing list to the Davidian members. When the Texas courts hold a session to liquidate the land assets of the association, Roden wins the majority vote and acquires the land in Elk, Texas. He calls his movement the Branch Seventh-day Adventist. Eventually, the group is called the Branch Davidians.
His movement was really named Branch Seventh-day Adventist. He did not use the name Davidian. But because he acquired this Mount Carmel property where Davidians' headquarters was, and people understood that, eventually they became known as Branch Davidians, but they never were. That was not their name. They did not use that.
But particularly after this sudden death of Victor Houteff, he showed up and said, "You all are looking for an important sign. I have the sign for you. I have the message." And my message is that the new Messiah will be called, according to the book of Isaiah, the branch.
He started teaching the feast laws. And the reason why is I knew him very well. I'd been to his house and visited with them, and we had become friends. And so when he began to teach that, I saw him there teaching it, and I realized that he was not teaching according to what Brother Victor had told us.
One of the main thing he was, I would say, adding to the message of the shepherd's rod was that we should observe feast days. And that created a division in the organization, because the original message of the shepherd's rod did not advocate we should be observing feast days at this time, because we don't think it is applicable at this time. But he was saying they should observe the feast days, the new moons, Feast of Tabernacles, those kind of feast days, the Passover. But the original message didn't promote that. It created a division. And in this division, he started a movement called the Branch Davidian. So now we have the Davidians and we have the Branch Davidians.
If you see the Davidians as a reform group of Seventh-day Adventists, then the Branch Davidians are yet another split, another branch off of the original Davidians. So this was his idea. He had Jewish background, and so as he took over this movement, he offered to take over, and they rejected him at first. And this was in '55. But then, when Florence's prediction failed, and in '62 they disbanded and so forth, then he showed up again and was interested in leading the small group of about 50 who were left there, and was able actually to buy the property and to carry on there. So he had a home, he had a place, he had a following. So his teaching was I think influenced by his Jewish background.
For over 25 years, Benjamin Roden and his wife Lois lead the Branch movement together. They even make a pilgrimage to Israel to gain more converts. The mission trip does not go well with the Jewish community there. Benjamin Roden is deported for his evangelism activities, and his wife Lois is jailed for 2 years, then released. In 1978, Roden dies. His son George Roden has been groomed as the successor of his father's movement and is heir to the property and assets belonging to his father. But Lois Roden has other plans. Lois claims the prophetic mantle has fallen upon her and begins to teach unique doctrines such as the femininity of the Holy Spirit. Lois goes to court and wins control of the estate.
The other thing that she did was to write extensively on the role of women as leaders in the church. So there's a kind of a feminism that's operating here in this. I mean, it's such a contradiction in some ways, because you think of the group as conservative, as insular, isolated, and so on, but at the same time, it's precisely in these little groups that you have the opportunity for women to make a mark, to become leaders, to show what they know and can do, and so forth. And then she published a pretty remarkable journal for that time. It's called the Shekinah, which is a Hebrew word that means the presence of God. And she spelled it with a S-H-E at the beginning, in all capitals, so that you got the idea that emphasized the women and the role of the women in all of this.
Ben Roden died. His wife took over. She began to teach the doctrine that there would be, the Holy Spirit would be likened as a woman. And then later she died, and of course Koresh came in before she died, and he took control of the property. And from then on came the burnout in 1993.
Lois meets a young charismatic Seventh-day Adventist named Vernon Howell and is taken with him, but her young suitor has plans of his own. Vernon Howell will soon become David Koresh, the self-proclaimed sinful Messiah and the leader of the Branch Davidians.
In her last days, she ended up marrying Vernon Howell, who joined the movement. Now, I met both of them. I do not know exactly if it's a legal marriage or what, but I met both of them, Vernon Howell and Louise Roden, the wife of the Benjamin Roden. And she told me he married him, and he wanted to get into her bank account. She used that word, you know. He wanted to get into her bank account, and she said she, dismissed him. So when I met them back in Louisiana, I think I was at the Joint Conference session in Louisiana, New Orleans. I think that was 1985, thereabout. I met them. And they were not really together. They were really disputing among themselves. Later on, she died in 86. In 1986, she died. And then when she died, there was a dispute now who would take over the Branch Davidian movement. It was a dispute between David Koresh and the son called George Roden.
Eventually, Vernon gains control of the Branch Davidian compound, but not without violence. Vernon Howell and George Roden engage in a violent shootout with each other while disputing who should be the rightful leader of the branch. All are arrested, but released, and the two sides battle it out in court. Eventually, the courts side with Vernon Howell. Once in control, Vernon Howell will begin to stockpile weapons, introduce the practice of polygamy to the sect, and lead the Branch Davidians into a doomsday scenario with the federal government. For the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist, Vernon's brand of doctrine proves to be too extreme.
In our estimation as Davidians, we do not believe Mr. Koresh and his followers was a representation of the Davidian movement, because what they carried on here with is not what the Davidians stand for. They had guns, it's proven. They were training with guns. They were implementing all kind of things here with guns. Davidians do not believe in armament. We do not believe in carrying weapons. They claim that he was doing polygamy here with the girls and all that. Davidians do not believe in those things. We do not practice those things. So his operation was a bad reflection of the Davidian movement. Davidians are vegetarians. They're not vegetarians. Davidians don't drink alcohol. There's a different story with him. I came here one time, just maybe a month before the fire came, and I saw him personally. And he said to me up front, "Don't bring to me Houteff. I do not want to hear anything about Houteff, VTUF. I do not go to the St. Adventist Church." He says, "I go to the rum bar. That's where I get my converts." And at that moment, he pointed to a gentleman right there and says, "See that brother there? He came from the rum bar." That's the way he said it to me, straight, So I was a bit disappointed because I thought they were running here a really religious organization, but it was something else. It was something else.
He was the one that changed his name to David Koresh. He came here, and he said he wanted to talk with us. And I was teaching some students at the time, so we stopped. And he came inside, he went to the blackboard, and he began to write some things up there on the blackboard and telling us that Jesus Christ was talking to us. And so I myself and the others, we just assumed that he's talking about the Bible. And he continued on. Finally he said, "In fact, Jesus Christ is right here in this room." And again, we thought, all right, spiritually or by the unction of the Holy Spirit, as he said, "I will be with you always until the end." So we thought he was talking about Jesus. And then finally he said, "Jesus in this room," and I myself asked him to give some more explaining, and that's when he told us that he was Jesus Christ. He never told us he was the sinful Messiah. That came later. But he told us that he was Jesus Christ, and that he had a message to come and tell us. And I told him that we'd heard enough, that we did not want to believe that he was Jesus Christ coming. And so he prepared to leave. That's when my wife asked him, why do you go to Davidians when we can see you're not even dressed like a Davidian, and you don't represent properly like a Davidian? Why do you do that? And he says, I go to them because they believe in a prophet. It makes it easier for me to show them that Jesus, a prophet, has come.
He had some 16 or 17 children by 11 or so women, so he was actually very, very active sexually. And it's interpreted in a variety of ways. Most people on the outside see this simply as his own quest for pleasure and power and controlling the whole community and so forth. Because as you say, he went first for unmarried younger girls and so on, and then he claimed also the wives of men who were in the community as well. So his theological justification was that in the book of Revelation it says there'll be 24 elders who will judge everybody in the final judgment. And so he wanted his children to be, he thought that these children would become those elders, would become those judges, and would judge fairly because they came from him.
I met David Koresh while he was living in California, because he did go to California trying to get into the music business because he loved music. He always had his guitar, you know. So I was living in California back then in 1985, 86, 87, and there I met him at church. Just a normal person. And he was expressing to me that he would really like to put the message of the shepherd's rod in music, because he just loved to, you know, play his guitar. So he always talked to me, you know, how could he really transfer this message into a song, you know, about the kingdom, about the David kingdom, you know, talking like that. But anyway, I didn't see him for a while. Then I came to live in Texas about 91. And I heard that he was at this place, Elk, Texas. So I decided to go and look for him, just see what's going on, because I didn't really know the details those days about the Branch Davidian movement, but I heard that they were over there 25 miles away in Elk. So I decided to visit him, and I did get in contact with him. He was there, maybe 92, thereabout, maybe some months before the big fiasco took place. And as I met him, he started out by trying to explain to me the 7 seals. He loved the 7 seals, because he was trying to say, well, he was the person to open the 7 seals, you know. So I said to him, I said Vernon at that time, because that's what I knew him as, Vernon Howell. I said, Brother Howell, I am a Davidian. I have a book written by Houteff on the 7 seals. So what are you going to tell me about the 7 seals that I don't know? And he said, listen to me, Brother Archer. Don't you bring to me that Houteff stuff. I am the prophet. You listen to me. So then I realized there was a change here now. You know, he was now the self-proclaimed prophet too, you know. And, you know, he was impressing upon me, you know, come over here and let me give you some studies. But then I realized something was wrong, you know. He was no declaring himself to a prophet, to be a prophet. And I did not acknowledge him as no prophet. So, you know, I was looking at him now with a different, you know, eye, looking at him in a different way now. So then I realized that the Vernon Howell that I knew back then in 87 or 85 was not the Vernon Howell I'm now seeing in 92.
The Davidian movement has been racked with conflict and controversy. Those that consider themselves true to Houteff's original message, like Donna Dare, insist this is something Houteff predicted, and the turbulent history doesn't sway them from their beliefs. For them, adhering to the simple lifestyle Houteff recommended and continuing to spread the shepherd's rod message is a way of life.
I would have to say that it's the opposition from the enemy. That's what it would be. So I'd have to say that there would be false ones would come up, just like they have false ones have come up all through the ages, even in the days of Jesus, clear up through the dark ages and so on. There's always false people bringing false doctrine, and it's no different today.
Well, it's a sad situation. But the Lord has a way of allowing bad things to happen to promote his message. It's not the first things that has happened, you know. So one thing, the Waco fiasco brought attention, give a worldwide attention to the message of the shepherd's rod.
You could argue either way, and you know, at the time and after that, you hear the testimony of the Davidians said, no, we didn't do that, and the government officials, no, we didn't do that. So I mean, because that was what was so horrific. Obviously, it burned all these people; they wouldn't come out. You know, I mean, tear gas didn't do it, fire didn't do it, and so there was a loss of about 80 people altogether. I think that it's probably the worst disaster of that sort that we've suffered in our country.
Others, like Norman Archer, look forward with great anticipation to the fulfillment of Houteff's prophecies.
Our mission right now has not changed. It is the same. We basically are trying to create a revival within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we're also trying to inform them that the Middle East crisis right now is just a precursor for a bigger mission in the Middle East. Before the end of the world comes, the Lord has planned here to restore a kingdom in Palestine, Jerusalem. The Jews since 1948 who have been going back to Palestine are claiming the fulfillment of these prophecies in Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. But the fact is, Jews today are descendants of only two tribes. The Lord promises to restore the 12 tribes, Judah and Israel, all 12. That's one of our major messages we are trying to promote at this time, which will not just be an information to the church, but an information to the whole entire world. We want the whole world to realize that the Middle East crisis right now is just a precursor for a bigger event, where the Lord is to glorify himself in that same piece of territory. And another point we need to also make it clear is that today Israel, the state of Israel today is just about 100 miles long and about 50 miles wide. The land that God gave to Abraham extends from the river Euphrates down to the river Egypt. So Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, those countries right now basically are a part of the promised land. So the war that is going on today in the Middle East is taking place in the Holy Land. It's a holy war, but not many people understand that God is involved in this war. This is not a war with America, or with Russia, or with the Arabs, or with the Jews. This is a holy war going on right now, and it has a predicted end. How it will finish. God is to glorify himself in the last days in that promised land, when he gathers the people of God from the four corners of the earth and establish his kingdom, which we call the Davidic kingdom.
From Houteff's original movement, two major factions remain: the Branch Davidians and Davidian Seventh-day Adventist. Under the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist faction, 7 or more associations have sprouted up since the dissolution of the original Mount Carmel, all who insist they follow the original Shepherd's Rod message. Unlike the Branch Davidians, they reject the notion that there could be another prophet after Houteff. Even so, between them there are slight variations of how they interpret Houteff's message. Presently, Don Adair is the vice president of the Salem Association. Norman Archer is a Davidian missionary and former vice president of the Waco Association. There are also associations in Tennessee, Missouri, Africa, and Canada. Between these associations, the Davidian believers number in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. As far as the Branch Davidian faction, the numbers have dwindled since the siege. One thing that remains certain: Branch Davidians and Davidian Seventh-day Adventists remain hopelessly at odds in doctrine, mission, and objectives, yet forever linked by a name.
The word cult can be seen in many ways, but I would say generally right now, people look at the word cult as a group of people that are fanatical, extremists, being led by some charismatic leader, and they can't think for themselves. They are just brainwashed. That's what people would view right now as a cult. Now, The Davidian movement in no shape and form is anything like that. We are normal people, living normal. We don't live in a commune where one man tells us what to do. We are normal people, and the Davidian movement is a worldwide operation. It's not just a little group of brethren over there in Texas of Waco. No, no. The Davidian movement is a worldwide operation, getting the attention of Seventh Adventists across the whole spectrum of Seventh Adventists, across the world. It is a movement within the Seventh Church promoting revival and reformation. It has nothing to do with a cult, with a man leading, directing, dictating. No, that's not what Davidian is look like at this time. The Davidian movement is a group of people that is a worldwide operation, not a cult.
You can believe whatever you want to, and it's a question of when you go beyond that to action and so forth that may harm people, like having sex with an underage girl or stashing weapons or whatever. Again, I mean, if that's a part of the practice, then that's when I think the government steps in and say, well, we have to think about the entire society as a whole. So it's, our liberties and our security. It's a parable for all of us for lots of time, I suppose.